Welcome, everybody, to Inside Boxing Daily on the Grueling Truth Sports Network. Inside Boxing Daily is brought to you by BetDSI. You can go to thegruelingtruth.com, click on the BetDSI banner at the top of the page, and you can get up to a first deposit bonus of 100% up to your first $1,000 put in by putting in the promo code TGT. I am also the Retired Boxers Foundation with Jackie Richardson and Alex Ramos. I am your co-host for Inside Boxing Daily, my good pastor. Right now, I'd like to welcome in Jeremiah Pricer. How you doing, Jeremiah?
Very, very good, man. It's Sunday night. Wouldn't want to be anywhere else but here, man.
Yeah, and it's a weird day because we woke up and Andy Ruiz has the most heavyweight championship belts of everybody there.
Yeah, I know, and he might. It's an odd thing for sure. I mean, I don't think a lot of us are eating crow because just about nobody suspected that this would be the case. He had a few guys. I mean, I even saw on Twitter there was who was it? It was some well-known. I think it was Al Bernstein or something. He was like, "Hey, raise your hand if you think Andy Ruiz is going to win." And I think there were there were like 2-3 people sprinkled in there who were like, "All right."
Last names were all Ruiz.
Yeah, it was Ruiz, Perez, stuff like that, and he got the job done, man. I mean, you got to give him credit there.
Yeah, so where does he go from now? Is there any way he could get out of this rematch? Because the thing I don't like about it, he signed a contract, so I got no problem with the rematch clause. But as the champion now, to me, Andy Ruiz, the best thing for boxing would be Andy Ruiz at the Staples Center defending against Anthony Joshua.
Yeah. You said at the Staples Center against Anthony Joshua?
Yeah. I mean, in L.A., somewhere in L.A., wherever, whatever you call the place, it used to be the Fabulous Forum. But I think it would be crazy to do it anywhere but there because you've got, right now, Mexicans are going to take notice of him. And Anthony Joshua, he needs to redeem himself here. I mean, because he's basically hid his entire career at home and fought from home. And the first time he comes away from home, he gets knocked out by a guy that's, a 11-1, 12-1 underdog? So, yeah, I think with the questions here, what Andy Ruiz did, he deserves the respect to fight this fight in his backyard. And, I mean, it makes no sense to me to go fight in New York on 4 weeks' notice, whip this dude's ass. And this is not, no matter what anybody says, this is not like Lennox Lewis losing to Oliver McCall or Lennox Lewis losing to Haseem Rockman. Those were one-shot knockouts. This was a fight where Andy Ruiz kicked Anthony Joshua's ass from the third round on, in my estimation. And when you look at the scorecards,
not one of the judges.
That's what I was going to say. You look at the scorecards. Well, 2 of them did have him up by a point. I can see that. But to think that Joshua had the lead on another card, to me, just calls into question how shady this shit's going to be if you go to England for this fight.
Well, and you know what's funny is there's a noticeable pattern, and we've even talked about it in the past. I mean, it's easy to forget all the stuff we talk about. I mean, we've been doing this show for 3 years now. I mean, a lot longer than most of the guys in the business. A lot of these guys just started churn them out recently. But one thing we talked about was how the pattern that you get in big fights like this, where you will have one guy who he airs way on the side of the big money guy, and then you'll have one guy who ends up turning in a draw, and then you'll have another guy who gives it to the other guy who actually seems like he's being fair. And I wouldn't have been surprised if this was, going to the distance, if we would have had something kooky like that, where, again, one guy would, the one guy who obviously had Joshua up was just going to stay that way the entire time. And then the other 2 judges, again, they would have been a bit more fair, but they would have made it so Joshua wouldn't have had a loss on his record. Again, I don't know. It's impossible to say. But again, with the way things are, it just wouldn't have been surprising in the least. But I'm with you. I mean, it sucks that the rematch clause stipulates that that Ruiz would go to England and fight Joshua, because he won the belt, and all of a sudden he's being put in a situation where it's not on his terms, seeing as he won the fight. And I bet the WBC is probably kicking themselves in the ass right now because they tried so long and so hard, to get somebody like Chris Arreola to be the first heavyweight titleist of Mexican descent, and ultimately their belt wasn't up for grabs in this one, when they made that history. But yeah, I think Al Heyman would probably like to put him in LA against Joshua. It would make a lot of sense. I mean, and even beforehand, we were talking about that. Like, New York City, yeah, it's going to draw some fans just because of the population size, and it's a bit bigger of a fight town. But yeah, if you put this in LA beforehand, it would have drew even bigger. And I'm sure Al Heyman would like to be able to milk this situation of more dollars than he can, and maybe he will. I mean, I don't know how it plays out. It's in the contract, but I don't think that means that he has to do it. So I don't know how they're going to play this out, but I also think Al Heyman wouldn't mind putting Wilder in against Josh or Ruiz, and then that little unification, and then you have more drawing power there, and then you could have the Fury rematch. And I think that would be an interesting proposition too, just because at that point you would have a legitimate 1 and 2 guy.
Yeah, and we get a comment from Jeb on sports, which was a Twitter comment, which I'm going to go ahead and bring up. It wasn't directed at us now. Well, I guess it was. It was 5 minutes ago, so never mind. But Jeb says Ruiz, he needs to invest his money from this upset and be prepared for a short reign as an accidental champion. Is that a fair assessment from Jeb on sports?
So I think that it is. And again, I don't want to say accidental in the sense that he didn't win the fight. I mean, this wasn't a lucky punch. I don't.
No, he whooped his ass. So maybe Anthony Joshua was an accidental champion too, that had to be in the right place at the right time.
Well,
if you know what I mean.
My thing is, I wouldn't use the word accidental because, they've certainly worked their way into this, and, Ruiz strategized well and it got the job done. And, again, we talked about we analyzed the fight last night. It was really nice to see Ruiz throw a jab to the chest, and he was throwing some power jabs there too. He was investing to the body, he was throwing in combination when he did let his hands go. There are a lot of good things that he did, but when we were talking off air, and one of the reasons that we're doing this show regardless is, the state of guys who win fights like this, heavyweights who win big, who win in big upsets.
And you've seen some of them in your time. You saw Rockman beat Lennox Lewis, which we know what happened to Rockman after that. And
Sanders Klitschko, Brewster Klitschko.
Well, I don't know that. I don't think those upsets. I think Brewster Klitschko was similar to an upset of this magnitude. I don't know that Sanders Klitschko was, because by then, did Sanders not get knocked out by Klitschko first or Brewster?
So did Sanders get knocked out by Klitschko first?
No, Klitschko. I mean.
So Klitschko got knocked out by Sanders first.
Yeah.
And I do know that it is different because, it is different, but I try to put it in the thing about it is Klitschko at the time held the WBO belt, and it was lightly regarded at the time. It was not seen as a real championship belt. I mean, just go look at the times. I mean, there's a lot of revisionist history going on, but people didn't take the WBO seriously. That's why Lennox Lewis never tried to unify for it, and that's why when Vladimir Klitschko became the WBO titleist, nobody was really clamoring for him to unify. People weren't using terms like that back then. So, he just seemed like he was a top level European guy. He did beat Chris Bird, so we've got to acknowledge that. So it was different. But my thing about this fight too is Joshua was not the heavyweight champion either. And neither was Klitschko. But I suppose that Joshua at this stage of his career is maybe, what do you think? I mean, do you think Joshua at this stage of his career before the upset, was seen as a better fighter than Vladimir Klitschko before his loss to Corey Sanders? Because my thinking is that maybe they were in a similar
I think
position.
they probably were. But
Okay,
I just think this. I mean, Corey Sanders and Lamont Brewster seem like bigger threats than Andy Ruiz did. And I thought Andy Ruiz,
agreed.
I think he's a talented guy. But we have a question from Hamed. And the question was Joshua mentally in a different place, or did fighting on the road give him trouble? He was training in Miami. Was he more caught up in the city life than the training camp? And I think this, and me and John talked about this even before the fight yesterday, that when I look at this, I didn't think he looked real interested in fighting, even when you watched what's the show DAZN call or whatever the DAZN show is, where they do like the 3 parts during the week. He did not look like he was ready to get in a fight, and his body language with Ruiz is they almost looked like they were being buddies. So I don't think. I mean, maybe Anthony Joshua just got too happy. You know, the most I can equate this with is probably the most similar would have been Rocky Balboa when he fought Clubber Lang.
Yeah. It was
Because
like
he got civilized, and when fighters get civilized, it ruins them.
it does. It really does. I mean, even somebody as ferocious as like Jack Dempsey. I mean, historians actually
Oh
they
yeah, that's
differ.
why he was taking off 3 years between fights.
Yeah, well, yeah, actually, I mean, you'll hear the term. It's not often, but you'll hear the term. Like some of the historian buddies that I know, they'll call him Hollywood Jack Dempsey because when he was beating the crap out of the guys on the way up. I mean, he didn't revolutionize boxing per se, but back in the day, a lot of the fights went the distance or very close to it. They were seen as these things that oftentimes dragged out. And Jack Dempsey, just basically came in there and kind of lived by, Rocky Marciano's motto, where he's like, well, you're not getting paid you're not getting paid for overtime. So he would just go in and, punch the clock in and out as quickly as he could. And then once he turned Hollywood and he was doing all these gigs, and you know how heavyweight champions at the time were, doing vaudeville shows and all sorts of guest appearances on places, and especially when it was the biggest sport in the nation. I mean, we've got to understand that because it's one thing for, these modern guys to go on Conan O'Brien or, one of these late night shows and do a funny little interview and, personalize themselves to people. But this was Jack Dempsey being the biggest sports figure in the entire nation, so it was a bit different there. So when he went to Hollywood, it changed him. He got softer and he wasn't the same fighter. And it very well could have been the same thing with Anthony Joshua. But my thing is,
I think this, real quick, I want to bring this up and give kudos to you. I don't really know what kudos means, but it sounds like it fits here. But I would like to give kudos to you because you brought up something about a sports psychologist earlier in the week, too, that I'd forgotten about till you reminded me tonight. But when we were talking off air, I did remember you saying this. And it was about how he wasn't really into trading and stuff. And when you look at that now, it all kind of makes sense.
yeah, and I'm going to go right to that. But again, we appreciate your comments, Hamad. I mean, you're always chiming in, so we appreciate that. Um, so I want to answer the question: was it the city life? It's really hard to say unless it's impossible to get inside of a guy's head, and oftentimes you get conflicting reports, and all of a sudden when things like this happen, all of a sudden you start hearing different stories saturating the news headlines. I mean, I even heard a story today that his father was pissed off at Eddie Hearn for taking the fight because what was it like? He was concussed from sparring a heavyweight like a few weeks ago or something, and he wasn't totally prepared. I try not to get too involved in these stories just because a fighter, especially somebody of Joshua's ilk, he's really supposed to know what it's like to be a fighter, how to be mentally prepared, and how to get ready. Is it possible that, like you said and Teddy Atlas said on ESPN, what was it, yesterday, that, he's waking up in silk he's waking up in silk sheets every day and it just makes it hard to train? Maybe, but the dude looks like he's in damn good shape all the time. But I will say,
his weight was up though, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was 247. So he was actually on the big side there. But I will say, in my reference to the sports psychologist thing, going back to this, that I do think, again, I don't like to read too much into this, but I do think it plays somewhat into this because if you're hiring a sports psychologist because you say, and again, this isn't verbatim, but you say that the training camps are taking their toll on you, I do think that's an indication that you don't really like it. I mean, I know somebody like Muhammad Ali wasn't in love with training either, but he understood the importance of
He
it.
was in love with winning, though.
Exactly.
And if you watch Anthony Joshua after that fight last night, he didn't look pissed off that he lost.
Well, and
That right there says more about this than anything else.
Yeah, and I would even take that back to the second knockdown of the fight. He didn't get up and have that grit about him, like that Aaron Pryor look. Like you knocked him down, he's like, well, all right,
he
man.
spit the mouthpiece out instead of biting down and fighting, and that was literally what happened.
Exactly. I mean, well, and I'm talking about even the second knockdown though of the entire fight, where it seemed like it just seemed like it was kind of a slow count. I mean, the referee looked like he was giving him, and this is referring to all the knockdowns. And it looked like he was giving Joshua all the benefit of the doubt to try and get things to go ahead. But yeah, it was really the last one where Joshua looked disinterested. He's like, I don't want to do this anymore. He was blowing hard from like the third round on, and the part of it I think too is I think part of it is stamina as well. When you're that big, I mean, Joshua's had stamina problems his entire career. We all know, I mean, as boxing fans, we're all aware of something quite basic, and that's when you're a muscle-bound guy, your stamina is going to suck. I don't care how many medicine balls you throw into the ground or, how much resistance training you're doing. Honestly, I don't care if you
Mike
like it.
Mike Weaver did knock John Tate out with 45 seconds left in the 15th round, though.
Right.
And he also stopped Harry Coetzee in the 13th round in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Right. No, you're right. And Weaver was one of,
he's an exception to the rule, though.
Exactly. Well,
we do have some more questions, too.
Sure. Okay, real quick, I was just going to say he's not like Joshua. He wasn't as big as Joshua. I mean, naturally, you're going to have stamina problems if you're that big.
All right, next we got a question from Hamed. Again, a few of them. All right, my wife interrupted me. I'm sorry to the millions of people listening worldwide, but she takes precedent. All right, was Joshua's game plan wrong? He had no jab, was not keeping distance, throwing too many right hands. I think that's true because we talked about this, and I think that seems to be the problem. You don't have too many heavyweights that are 6'6" and above that have careers that are real good for any extended period of time, because when you're fighting a guy that's 6'2", you're giving up that leverage right away, and Joshua technically is not a bad fighter, but he doesn't move his head, and when you're not throwing a jab and you're letting a smaller guy get in there, and let's face it, when I watched this fight again today, it wasn't like Ruiz was like this technical masterpiece. I mean, he was winging shots and hitting me.
Yeah, well, I do think Joshua is a good technical fighter. I mean, his footwork is good. He understands balance. He understands timing. But to say that his game plan was not good, I think is absolutely correct. I mean, we talked about the key, some of the keys to victory going in. We didn't outline it in that manner, but we figured that Anthony Joshua was just going to keep him on the end of his stick, keep him at distance, and eventually find him. And Joshua, maybe the worst thing for him was that he caught Ruiz with that left hook in the third round and hurt him, and then he tried to finish him and got caught himself and never really seemed to recover.
Yeah, and I think the other question is, we have another question. AJ seemed gassed out early. Do you think the weight, probably north of 250 by the time they get in the ring, had something to do with this, and what would his optimum weight be? And I think from watching Joshua and watching him in the past, I think he gasses because he's got the big muscles, but it's kind of like the difference between George Foreman in the early 70s and George Foreman in the early 90s. to me, Anthony Joshua doesn't look real fluid. You know what I mean? It's like he's all tensed up all the time, and that'll wear you out.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, there's something that isn't acknowledged enough, actually. And when we talk about stamina and whatnot, we have to understand the mental exertion that comes with it. I mean, you watch a guy like James Toney, who all he was doing was like running on a treadmill from time to time and sparring. I mean, that's all he was doing for his training going into fights. And he would come in looking round. He was undersized for the heavyweight division, at least in terms of height. He started as a middleweight, but he was able to go the distance because he wasn't afraid of anything. I mean, he had an absolute confidence in his ability, and I do think there is probably a combination of things working in there with Joshua, where his optimum weight, to answer the question, is probably I would like to see him in the real low 240s, because I don't think he's ever going to get to the 230s like he was when he first started. So I think his best bet is probably 240 if he can get there. I just like to see him lose a little bit of that muscle, but it could be the fact that he is tense. I mean, mentally, maybe he's just not. He's not as confident as guys like James Toney and whatnot were, and I think maybe it's because he's aware of his own susceptibilities, right? Because he's been stunned by Povetkin. He was put down by White, he was hurt by White. I think he was dropped by White in the amateurs. Maybe he's been stopped in the amateurs. Maybe that plays on his mind a lot of times, where he's not that, because you see, like, just look. Here's an example I actually think is relevant for the night. Look at Delphine Persoon and look at Anthony Joshua. Persoon, you could tell, was completely confident that she was going to be able to take whatever shots were coming her way from Katie Taylor. Joshua is obviously not nearly that confident, and it really does affect how long you can go and how long you can keep your arms up. So I do think there's a mental and physical aspect to it. But yes, I think that his optimum weight is probably in low 40s. And I think that he should have just jabbed and stayed at distance. I really and it's funny because I think he even commented on Facebook when I was telling somebody, because Rick Glazer's given Robert McCracken, Joshua's trainer, a bunch of shit, or no, it was Don King, I think was the quote, who's given McCracken a bunch of shit, saying he was a bad trainer, basically. And I'm like, dude, if you listen to the advice given by McCracken, he was telling him just jab, stay at distance, and fucking move. And Joshua just didn't do it. So I don't think that's McCracken's fault. I think this was all Joshua.
All right. We had Robert from California that says, what the hell? Robert from California says, stop with this women's shit. LOL. I'm just kidding, but I can't stand listening to women's boxing analysis.
Well, Mr. Robert from California, I mean, but if you listen to this show with any regularity, we're not a fan of women's boxing either. But I'm hoping that you understand that there's
I am a fan of Katie Taylor, though, and Delphine Persoon now, because that was a hell of a fight, whether they were men or women.
Yeah, I mean, Persoon really went out and got it, but I hope he understands it. I'm just using that as a prudent example for this, because Persoon, yeah, she's a woman, but I mean, if you want me to use a man, like somebody like Antonio Margarito or Ricardo Mayorga, guys who, or Aaron Pryor, guys who didn't give a shit if you clipped them, because they knew they were going to be able to take it and keep coming, and eventually, the exercise of their will was going to trump the exercise of your will. And Joshua's just not that kind of a guy. I mean, sometimes he kind of seems like to be honest with you, it seems like Joshua would rather stand at mid-distance and hook with a guy than stay at distance and jab and cross a guy and make things easier on himself. And I think that showed in the Ruiz fight too.
Yeah. We have another question. Liam Scott. At Liam Scott, I assume that's his name. He said, it just occurred to me that the WBO mandatory is due soon. Is it next? Which is a question. And is there any danger of Ruiz being stripped of the WBO title if the Joshua rematch takes place?
That's a good question. To be honest with you, I don't pay attention to, the WBO's rankings because I honestly don't care because, these things are bought and paid for anyways. But seeing as the WBO has a tight relationship with Europeans and, there's an immediate rematch clause in the contract, I don't think the WBO would strip him. I think that would be I think it would be a terrible choice on their part to, fracture the division even more when we're just starting to get a little bit more clarity. When it just seems like we've just inched closer and closer over the years to getting, finally a guy who's holding all the alphabet trinkets and hopefully a guy who's considered the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. So I'm hoping that and again, it's hard to predict because sometimes like the IBF, they're hard asses when it comes to their rules, but a lot of people, I think they get a faulty perception when it comes to that because the IBF, they are better about that, but they're also better about it because they're stationed in America and because they've already been under investigation by the FBI years ago when, Bob Arum was, paying $100,000 in bribe money to him. So we've got to understand that too. But I don't think at this point the WBO would risk it if Ruiz and Joshua, are slated for an immediate rematch. But you never know because there's a lot of politics at play. And if Bob Arum, who's real tight with the WBO, if maybe he's like, hey, well, can you let my guy have it, or can you make Oscar Tyson Fury versus whoever it is for the WBO, nothing would surprise me. But at this point, I don't think there's any threat of that right now because I think they would like the prospect of Anthony Joshua potentially winning the title back just because he's still going to be a big draw. And then they're still going to get a lot more sanctioning fees out of him than just about anybody else.
All right, we've got Egotistic, who says that he thinks that this is just a bad day at the office for Anthony Joshua, and all you Yanks are getting too excited about this shit.
I mean, I don't think I'm getting all that excited about it, to be honest with you. I mean, I actually got some flack on Twitter last night because Errol Spence was like, "Oh, you better, Anthony Joshua doesn't want any part of Deontay Wilder," and his comment was aimed at Anthony Joshua's chin, which is obviously not great. But I pointed out the fact that, Wilder's been dropped by Harold Sconiers, which tons of people seem to be ignorant about. I mean, Douglas Fisher's even commented on the fight before, and I think he was there, and he said Deontay Wilder got rocked badly and dropped near the end of the round, and he was on unsteady legs. But again, it was near the end of the round, and he got some reprieve there. Wilder's also been stunned by Eric Molina. He's been rocked by Luis Ortiz. To me, and I hope I'm being fair here, but I think that this could happen. This upset of this caliber could happen to Deontay Wilder just as it could happen to Anthony Joshua.
Yeah, it will, because they all suck, as I've told everybody from the start. So
well, and I think I've said this before. Maybe I'm wrong, but how I see it is Joshua Wilder. These guys are not on the level of a prime Vladimir Klitschko, and Vladimir Klitschko lost to Lamont Brewster and Corey Sanders. You know what I mean? So why wouldn't we suspect that it could happen to these guys who are not as good as Vladimir Klitschko? They're not as good as a prime Lennox Lewis, who got upset by Oliver McCall and got beat by Hasim Rahman. I mean, none of this should really be a surprise. And to be honest with you, I don't think because Ruiz knocked Anthony Joshua out, I don't think that necessarily indicates that Deontay Wilder would beat Anthony Joshua at this point. I don't think so. Actually, I think if Deontay Wilder had fought the level of competition that Anthony Joshua has,
he'd already lost.
It's likely that he would have already lost. So again, I'm not putting too much weight into it, but we really need to see how Anthony Joshua comes back because he just doesn't have the feel of a guy who would want to reform his style because there's no Emmanuel Stewart out there, right? He's not. I don't think Joshua can just revert his style to or confine his style to like a jab and grab style that Vladimir Klitschko had. I don't think that, but we're going to have to wait and see. I honestly don't know.
All right, we have another question, And this is from Hamed again. So, Hamed's only asked like 3 or 4 of the 8 questions tonight, though. So, I'm just teasing Hamed. We love when he asks, because actually, Hamed asks really good questions. Probably better questions than I was going to come up with for you, Jeremiah.
Yeah.
So
It's like Hamed's, yeah.
Hamed's last question, we call this Hamed's Corner, the last 5 minutes of every show. I'm just kidding. But Hamed, you ought to come on the show sometime. Last question, will Americans take to Joshua? I remember Klitschko struggling selling, but in America, can AJ still succeed in America, or is he better off going back to England in his comfort zone? Klitschko actually sold out many arenas, but wasn't taken to by the American public. Do you think there's a difference here, Jeremiah, or do you think that he's kind of doomed to the same fate as Klitschko was?
All right. Well, I know you and I have talked about this at length, so I don't think I'm going to summarize, but I think it's pretty nuanced because Anthony Joshua. Here's the thing about cultural differences between the UK and the United States is that Anthony Joshua, because of his demeanor, I got to be honest with you, a lot of Americans. And again, I know some of this may sound ignorant, but I'm just telling you how it is. But a lot of Americans kind of see the British accent as like a bit pompous, and it's hard to take guys like when Lennox Lewis used to talk shit, and he was trying to act like a hard ass there for a little while.
Has there been a British fighter that was really accepted big time in this country? Because Lennox Lewis, I don't think was so much accepted.
No,
he was
he wasn't.
respected.
Yes,
because he had guys like Holyfield and Tyson, and even to an extent David Tua to fight.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Well, and whenever Lewis tried to act like a tough guy, it just didn't come across as authentic. It felt forced. Like in America, there's a large portion of the fan base who are like street guys. Guys who come up rough. They come from poor backgrounds, and a lot of them live and breathe the street life. And for a lot of Americans, it's hard to accept. A British guy coming up rough. And again, part of that is TV. The perception is that, and plus when you watch American TV and British people are in it, a lot of them seem astute. I mean, some of it is just perception, and a lot of it is faulty as well. But there's just this perception that Joshua kind of like talks. I don't want to say pompous, but it sounds like that a little bit, and he's a nice guy. American sports culture has started to emphasize guys who are brash and cocky and willing to give you tidbits, in interviews and whatnot. I really think I don't ever think he's really going to be, especially after this loss, unless he just comes back, reforms himself, and dominates. Even then, I don't think he's going to be able to be a big sell here. It's just culturally there's differences, and Joshua, he just kind of seems synthetic. And I know we've talked about this on the show too, but Anthony Joshua he doesn't feel like he's being himself a lot of times. He feels restrained. He's kind of a pretty face, and I don't know, man. I don't think so. I really don't. I think. And to be honest with you, I get surprised why the Brits support him so much too. I don't know. I guess he's a nice guy, but as a fighter, he's not that interesting. His personality to me is not that interesting. And I still wonder about the whole superior race comment that he made. I mean, Eddie Hearn just basically blackmailed all the media people, and he was like, "Hey, shut up about this. We're not going to." Make this any bigger than it is. And then they try to say that it was that his account was hacked or something. I mean, I don't know. I just find it a bit odd that he would say like, hey, this is you're disappointing the superior race, and then a bunch of Brits are like, oh yeah, that's my guy. I don't know. It just feels a bit odd, but I don't think so. I don't know. What do you think, Mike? I can't see it.
What, him being big over here? Hell, Deontay Wilder can't be big over here, Hamed. What makes you think Anthony Joshua can? I mean, Deontay Wilder is like 40-something-0. There's only been one guy there are 2 guys that have went the distance with him, and he's not famous over here. So when you look at that, I mean, Tyson Fury, he's not famous over here. Andy Ruiz could be because Andy Ruiz is. I mean, Andy Ruiz is why we watch any sports, whether it's baseball, football, basketball, God forbid, soccer, anything. And the great thing about boxing is this is really the only sport that gives you this. Because in the Super Bowl, the best team in each conference that wins each conference plays. But every once in a while in boxing, you get a Rocky story. And that's why I think the most successful movies in sports are boxing movies. Because this stuff really does happen. You really can go from working a regular job to getting a title shot to winning that title shot and becoming a freaking legend. Buster Douglas did not have a great career, but for one night, he was as good as anybody that ever lived. And for the rest of his life, and for hundreds of years after his life is gone, people will still remember the night Buster Douglas was special. And the thing about boxing is, you know, you don't always have to be ranked at the top 10 or highly ranked. You just be in the right place at the right time when somebody gets hurt. You know, that's why a movie like Rocky struck such a chord, because that's all of us. Andy Ruiz is every one of us. We're all sitting around here just dreaming about the shot we wish we would get, or we're lamenting the shot that we had that we let get away. Andy Ruiz got that shot, and he made good on it. So if Andy Ruiz could do what 90% of people that pull upsets at the heavyweight division off, he could be huge. But he probably won't, because we talked about McCall, we talked about Rockman, I just talked about Buster Douglas. Leon Spinks, same thing. You know, he beats Ali. He was like a 7 or 8 to 1 underdog. In his next fight, in between February and September of that year, he gets in constant trouble with the authorities. He doesn't train the way he should. He's a little too happy, and that's it for him. Ali was different. When Ali was a big underdog against Liston, people saw just some dude that was cocky and he was quick, but they figured he's going to get his mouth shut. And he wins. But he goes on to be a legend. So, being a legend, he was not considered a legend before that, but he ended up being a legend. So, when you get that, he gets a pass on that. But everybody that's won a title, James J. Braddock, he wins the title and he goes in hiding for 2 years until he gets a sweet deal so he can cash in for the rest of his life with Joe Louis. Gene Tunney beat Jack Dempsey, which that was a pretty big upset back in the day, wasn't it, Jeremiah?
Yeah, it was, but he had enough sense to, just take the rematch and then I think
and then get the hell out. He didn't mess with the heavyweights anymore. Now, the heavyweight division was bad enough back then that I think that if he picks these cards right, kind of like what we talked about Roy Jones back in, the late 90s, he may have been able to defend it 3 or 4 times and he can get out with a little bit extra money, but he was smart, and he got out while the getting was good. But the majority of guys that pull off the upset like this, they've accomplished it. And the majority of guys that become heavyweight champion have accomplished it. When you look at the heavyweight division, to me, Ali and Joe Louis stand out. And then from about 3 through number 10, there's a bunch of other great fighters. But after those 10 guys, there's not a bunch of great heavyweights. And I think it's human nature when you've accomplished something so great, so big, and what you always dreamed of, it's hard not to have a letdown. It's hard to be Joe Louis. It's hard to be Muhammad Ali. It's hard to be Larry Holmes, Lennox Lewis, guys that can get up every time and just keep doing it. And really, Lennox Lewis, I don't put in the same class with an Ali or a Joe Louis for the simple fact, not that I don't think, because I think Lennox Lewis, with his physical skills, would give anybody that ever lived a hard time. But the reason I don't put him there with Ali is Ali didn't lose a fight till he was 11 years in, and it was to Joe Frazier in one of the greatest fights of all time.
Yeah. Could you imagine?
Yeah. I can't imagine Muhammad Ali catching a punch from Hasim Rahman or Oliver McCall and not getting up. Joe Louis got beat by Max Schmeling. But I think the big thing people miss here is this. If you look at the career of Max Schmeling, Hasim Rockman, and Oliver McCall, Max Schmeling's resume is a lot better than neither one of those guys. And it was a little bit younger Lewis, and Lewis made up for it by knocking him out in about a minute and a half after that, which Lewis did come back, and Oliver McCall quit in the fifth round, and Rockman got knocked out in, the fourth round with one big shot. But Joe Louis, the only loss he had at the time in his prime, he came back and avenged very quickly against Max Schmeling was a damn good heavyweight. So Ollie and Lewis to me were guys that outside of Lewis losing to Schmeling early in his career, nobody beat them in their prime. Rocky Marciano, no matter what anybody wants to say, I'm sorry. Nobody beat him. Prime, no prime, whatever. Nobody beat him. And the thing that makes that so great, and the reason I wrote the article about Marciano, and no, it's not, Gerald from, Maryland who said I was a racist and that's why I liked him. It's not. It's the same reason. I respect Floyd Mayweather. I respect Joe Calzaghe because they went undefeated. But the thing is this, at heavyweight to go undefeated and to fight 49 fights, it's really hard not to get caught at least once by somebody and get starched.
Well, yeah, and he did get caught a number of times, but he got up.
Yeah, and I mean, he usually got up quickly and then, broke the introduced jaw. So to me, those three guys stand out to me over anybody else because I think they were the most dominant during their time. Now, Lennox Lewis, Larry Holmes comes right after that. And don't get me wrong, I think Lennox Lewis and Larry Holmes, I think Larry Holmes would have beat beat Rocky Marciano's ass. I don't know if Lennox Lewis does or not because I don't care what people say about Rocky Marciano weighed 188 pounds. I'm betting Rocky Marciano hit harder than Hasim Rockman and Oliver McCall.
Well, yeah. And the thing too is, oftentimes you get criticism levied against Rocky Marciano because a lot of the guys that he beat were old, like Walcott and Charles and Lewis, and there's some truth to that. That's fine, but those guys are still the top-rated guys in their division. And this is the thing about heavyweight too is because of the state of the division. And when you talked about anything outside number one and number two with Joe Louis and Muhammad Ali, there's a lot of stuff you have to read into it. I mean, there's a ton of stuff.
You have to read into everything. That's what I mean. Outside of my top two.
Exactly.
Maybe three with Marciano, but really just my top two because I think they're heads and shoulders above anybody. The 3 through 10 guys, you could put them in almost any order between 3 and 10, and I would be fine with that.
Well, yeah, exactly, because here's the thing: is you could say, and again, I know I'm part of the International Boxing Research Organization. I've seen a lot of these guys talk about heavyweights, and this is what you'll hear from some guys. Okay, Marciano beat a bunch of old guys; he got lucky, right? You'll hear Larry Holmes fought a bunch of inexperienced guys, never unified the titles. You'll hear Jack Dempsey. Was really good, but never really beats a great fighter and didn't fight the only relevant black guy of his day. What else? You hear Jeffries beat smaller men. A lot of names, but smaller men.
With Foley and Lewis, nobody says anything like that.
No, with Joe Frazier, I've heard that he was crude, and
Joe Frazier was not crude. March the 15th, 1971.
No, did I meant to say George Foreman, but
yeah, but George Foreman, crude or not crude, I mean, if he hit you, you were done. Unless you were Muhammad Ali, who's the greatest that ever lived, or Jimmy Young.
Yeah, but I mean, you could say like Mike Tyson. I mean, Mike Tyson breaks the top 10 for a lot of guys. And
we have a question real quick that fits in with this because we're just going to go off on a Mike Tyson rant. The 13th round at the final tally asks, where do you rank Jack Johnson?
Well, to be honest with you, and again, we appreciate you chiming in. And I also appreciate your message. I think it was last night where you said, you appreciate the shout out. Again, I like working with you, man. Thank you for retweeting our stuff. And, I like retweeting your stuff too. I mean, you pay attention to the prospects more than
Yeah.
anybody I
I want to
know.
thank Hamed too, real quick, because
Yeah,
Hamed
yeah.
thanked us after his last question, but we want to tell Hamed he's very much appreciated also.
Yeah. Okay. So
Before I
I don't
forget.
have a proper list. I will be making one, but it won't be a definitive one because, the International Boxing Research Organization is redoing its all-time rankings. So I've
Nobody wants
had
to hear that. Where do you got him? You got him in the top five, top 10, top
uh,
15? You don't have to
uh,
give us a 1 through 10.
man, this is tough because I think Jack Johnson's pre-title resume is quite good when he was beating, Sam McVeigh and Jeanette and Langford. Of course, I think he only beat Langford once, but and Wills. I think his pre-title reign is pretty damn good, but his post-title resume it leaves me wanting because he beats Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, Stanley Ketchel, who's a middleweight. And it's funny because Jack Dempsey often gets criticism because they're like, hey, well, he didn't fight Harry Wills, the black guy of his day. And I'm like, well, Jack Johnson didn't he drew the color line too. He didn't fight any of those guys once they had fully developed. And, he even said himself that, nobody wanted to see two black guys fight. So if this is just a rough estimate, but I would probably say that I would probably have him about, I would say 5 through 7, but that's not definitive because, again, I don't have a list made up. Again, I really like his pre-title reign. He fought loads of tough guys to get where he was at, but then it seemed a bit like Jack Dempsey that he took it a little bit easier once he finally won the title and didn't give the best guys of his day a shot. But he was very skilled. He was an excellent defender, so I think that plays into everything as well. However, I also kind of err on the side of Monty Cox in his assessment that a lot of the guys that Jack Johnson fought were just straight ahead brawlers, guys that came right to him. So head to head, I don't think he beats a guy like, Joe Frazier. I don't. He probably doesn't beat somebody like George Foreman. Guys who could utilize some lateral movement like Larry Holmes, Ali. I don't think he beats Joe
What about
Louis.
a guy like Marciano that's going to come right at him? Is he strong enough to hold that off?
Well, I think it's tough because, Jack Johnson got to hold quite a bit more in those days than, Rocky Marciano got to. So I think that would be interesting. I don't know. I have a tough time calling that one because I think it would be interesting to see how Johnson would, strategize if he has to infight with Marciano. So I'm not going to call that one, but I think the guys who give him lateral movement give him serious issues, or the guys who just come in, not in a straight line so much, and some of the big guys too, like Lennox Lewis, Vladimir Klitschko, I'd probably favor over him too.
Yeah, I think this. I think he falls somewhere around 10 for me. I mean, he was a great fighter, but as you said, his pre-title reign was much better than his title reign. His title reign, there's not a whole lot there. I mean, the best fighter he fought was Stanley Ketchel. The only problem with that was Stanley Ketchel was a middleweight.
Yeah, it's just not strong. I mean, again,
because come on, Tommy Burns. I mean,
well, yeah, Tommy Burns. See, the thing about Tommy Burns is he was a good fighter, but it's usually acknowledged that he was at his best at
lower weight.
what's now the light heavyweight division. And so it wasn't as if he was a bad fighter, but he was outsized, he was outmuscled, he was outskilled. But then part of me thinks about like, well, how would he adapt if he had guys, moving from side to side and jabbing and whatnot?
How about this? What's he do against a 5 years younger James J. Jeffries?
Yeah, Jeffries
because if you look at title reigns, James J. Jeffries beat the better competition.
Yeah, so I think Jeffries had the better title competition, and I think Johnson had the better pre-title competition. But I rank Johnson higher because I think I think he was the better
That
fighter.
was not my question. I just said,
I
who do you
know.
think would win if
Uh,
they fought 5 years sooner?
I would still favor
I would
Johnson
favor
there.
Johnson too, but I think it
My
would be a really competitive fight, unlike the fight that happened 5 years later.
Yeah, because Jeffries was not, again, I know a lot of people like to say, oh, this was a historical moment, and in a way it was, sure. But Jeffries was really in no condition to take that fight. I mean, if Jeffries had just left well enough alone, you would hear his name alongside the greats more often
Well,
because
you'd hear it along Rocky Marciano because he was undefeated also.
Exactly. You would hear his name a lot more often, but now he's just kind of thrown in there a lot of times as a whipping boy for Jack Johnson. And again, Jeffries was just not prepared for that. I mean, he got pressured into it. I mean, I think in James J. Corbett's autobiography, trying to remember the author, but it's a gray book, gray and black. And he's, in a pose on the front. Damn it, I can't remember. But a lot of the content is about his acting career and not just about his boxing career. But, Corbett said that he wasn't supposed to tell anybody, but that Jeffries had a mental breakdown 3 days before the fight because all the pressure that was put on him. I mean, think about it. Jeffries was pegged as like the savior of the white race. I mean, we're not talking about a segment of the population or like you're like, oh, hey, you represent these people, right? It's not like Tyson Fury with the gypsies. I mean, we're talking about the entire white race, and they pressured him into fighting, and he was in no condition to do so. I mean, he ballooned up. He was on his farm, cleaning up pig shit or whatever he was doing, and then he got suckered into doing the fight, and he was just outclassed. My thing, though, is Jeffries is hard to pin down because the video footage doesn't really tell you a whole lot. He looks like a big physical guy. By all accounts, he was real athletic. He was certainly strong. I mean, he took a bunch of clean flush shots from Bob Fitzsimmons, who could knock out guys that were 260 pounds. So to me, Jeffries was athletic, and he was a hard hitter, and he was tough. But I just think he would probably be outdone by the better skilled and savvier Jack Johnson.
All right. We do have one more question, which is not pertaining to heavyweights. This is from Robert in Cali. And his question is, what will the interest be in Pacquiao versus Thurman in July? Is this akin to Leonard versus Norris? I don't think it's Leonard versus Norris because I don't think Pacquiao's as far gone as what Leonard was. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's right. I do think that's right. I think Pacquiao is still widely seen as a top five-ish heavyweight.
Heavyweight? Get off the heavyweight.
Sorry, welterweight. Well,
you know
sorry.
what though? I think so little of the heavyweights that I think you might be right. He could be a top 5 heavyweight. Joshua has trouble with shorter people.
Yeah, that'd be a real short person. He has real quick hands.
Yeah, he'd be running around biting his ankles.
Punching his knees. Put on an exhibition and see how that works. But yeah, I mean, I think Pacquiao's still widely viewed as a top 5-ish welterweight. I mean, he still has enough. You can see the signs of age. I mean, it's been there for a long time. In my opinion, and I've used this point many times on the show, but once Pacquiao moved up past like 130, 135, to me he was no longer at the peak of his powers because he was in a weight division where he was giving up physical advantages that he had at 126, 130, 135. I mean, he was bigger down there, and so then when he started fighting bigger guys, and it's funny, this is the thing, is a lot of people are like, oh, well, Manny Pacquiao, he was probably using performance enhancing drugs because he stopped knocking guys out at 147. Or he stopped knocking guys out after a period of time. And I'm like, well, if you examine the competition, and he's fighting Timothy Bradley.
Yeah, there were guys that were going to get knocked out very often.
No, Juan Manuel Marquez, Timothy Bradley. These are guys that you don't stop. And, he still showed enough power, knocking Chris Algieri down like 5 times. And he's still sharp, but I don't think he's as far gone as Terry Norris.
But how big a fight will this be? What do you think closed circuit would do? Did it do 500,000, $1 million?
On pay-per-view?
Yeah.
I still think that I'll go as far as saying it does $1 million.
You think it'll do $1 million? I was
Yeah,
going to say like a half a million, but
well, the reason I say $1 million is because Manny Pacquiao is still an icon. I still think that he draws a lot of power from his Filipino audience. I mean, the dude is really, again, he's an icon. I mean, he's a legend, and I think because of that, and not only that, he's seen by a lot of people as having a legitimate shot here. I mean, we talked about this on one of the shows too.
he does. But that's not because of what they think he's got left. I think it's because people have questions on what Thurman has left, as crazy as that may seem.
Yeah, well, and I think that adds intrigue to the fight because Keith Thurman.
This is one of the most interesting fights of the year to me.
Yeah, I agree because I think we're going to know. I think we're going to get. I hope, but I do think we're going to get a definitive answer where each one is at. I mean, is Thurman anywhere near the Porter fight or the Danny Garcia fight?
I think we're going to get a really good fight too, though.
Yes, because Pacquiao, even though he's old, he still can pull the trigger, and that is going to lead
and
to.
Thurman has never really shied away from contact.
Yeah, exactly, and that's what I used to like about Keith Thurman. I mean, he's not a guy who would stand there and slug with you, but he's a guy who can box and punch, and he can mix it up really well. In fact, in the welterweight division, outside of Terrence Crawford, I think Keith Thurman might be the best at mixing two different styles up. Though of course maybe I'm wrong because Errol Spence did show another element by just sticking a boxing Mikey Garcia. But I mean Manny Pacquiao's not as far gone here. I think it's a damn good fight. But I don't think we're going to get anything like Terry. I don't think so. I don't think we're going to get anything like that result either. At least, I don't know, man. I don't think it's going to be. I think Thurman is going to win, but I don't think he's going to beat. He's not going to be the Norris to Pacquiao's Leonard. He's not going to beat him up like that.
All right, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up because it's like midnight 13 where I live. All right, me and Jeremiah will be back at 11 o'clock tomorrow night for Inside Boxing Daily. Jeremiah, anything else before we wrap it up?
Anything else? No, I didn't really see anything. I don't really see anything in the news or anything. There's just been a lot of chatter on the Joshua Ruiz fight. And, I've actually, a lot of the Wilder fans are rejoicing because of it. But, my thing is, it's not a Wilder win. And a lot of people are complaining now. Even Kevin Iole got on Twitter, and he was like, "Oh, good job, Al Heyman and everybody involved. You just ruined a $100 million payday." And my thing is this. I think they should have fought already. We've talked about this on the show a bunch of times as well. They should have already got on with it. I mean, all this milking fights and marinating and, the Mayweather School of Economics, just putting it off and trying to get every dollar you can out of people. I don't like it. And due to the fact that Joshua was upset, I'm actually kind of happy because it shows you that the hype itself was just overblown. I mean, again, none of these guys are on the level of Vladimir Klitschko in his prime. I don't think they're on the level of Vitaly Klitschko in his prime.
Or Alexander Povetkin.
I mean, possibly. I mean, we saw how Povetkin was, how good he was at 38-39 against Anthony Joshua. I mean, most people had that fight, dead even. Some even had it, I think, 4-2.
And I'll give you this. Jerry Cooney would have wiped out everybody fighting today.
Yeah, it's just...
He would have.
I'm not doubting it, man.
Drop that hook on him. Maybe Fury gets him because Fury will bore him to death. But
yeah, Fury's sort of the exception just because he's so big. I mean, he's got an 85-inch reach. I mean, he's huge.
Well, remember, Cooney had like an 82 or 83-inch reach. Cooney was like 6'6", so.
Yeah, well, it's just Tyson Fury's style. I mean, you rarely get a guy who can move like that and, with that kind of wingspan. But I think all of these guys are susceptible to that. So, to me, it's not a Deontay Wilder win. They should have already got on with it. And again, I'm happy because I think a lot of the hype was unwarranted. I think most of the hype was unwarranted. I mean, I'm still not sure if Anthony Joshua is more like I think he's shown that he's a bit more like a Frank Bruno kind of level fighter. And I still think Deontay Wilder is I don't know. I mean, I like to compare him to Michael Grant,
Hey,
but I
my
think
dog wants us to wrap the show up because he's got to take a dump.
okay. Okay, well, we'll let your dog take a dump then.
That I think I did too. We've been on for an hour. That was pretty good. All right. So tomorrow night, join us for Andy Ruiz weekly show. It'll be on Monday night from now on.
We're talking Snickers.
Yeah, we're talking Snickers 24/7. All right, guys. Remember, you can hear all of our shows on iHeartRadio, iTunes, TuneIn, Spreaker, Stitcher, Spotify, Zeno Radio, wherever you find sports podcasts, you'll find The Grueling Truth. So for Jeremiah Pricer, I'm Mike Goodpastor. You've been listening to The Grueling Truth, where the legends speak.